So the 1 hour or so presentation that Sony did on their new PlayStation 5 console might not have been on everybody's liking, but there's quite a bit of useful information out there that we can extract from it, and I promised you guys that in the video following today's live stream I would bring you all the useful information that you need to know about the new generation. Of course, all of this until Sony comes in with a proper announcement, so there's quite a bit of information to go over, like some of the specs that have been talked about throughout the presentation, some of the upcoming features, and some of the main takeaways that we were able to gather from this premiere video that they have posted on their main channel. So let's jump into it, and as always, a thumbs up on this video would be super awesome. But I'm gonna start things off with probably the specs, since this is probably something that many of you are interested in. And of course we have Eurogamer over here that managed to release the PlayStation 5 specs. Of course, some of these have been talked about in the presentation, though I'm not entirely sure that all of these are 100% confirmed, so still take this with a grain of salt because a lot of hypothetical questions were raised throughout that presentation. Nonetheless, let's go over the CPU and the GPU, since obviously these are important. Of course, we knew probably for a year at this point that they're going to use the AMD architecture, so the CPU is going to use a second generation 8-core Zen CPU that's going to run at 3.5 GHz, but it's going to have a variable frequency. And just to give you a comparison with the Series X, since it obviously makes sense, they use a similar CPU, they use pretty much the same CPU, though at a higher frequency, in this case 3.8 or 3.6 with SMT enabled. As far as the GPU goes, it's 1028 teraflops, so I really hope that the discussion is now going to be ended by these specs compared to the 12 that the Series X has. 36 CUs at 2.23 GHz of variable frequency, of course, compared to 1.825 GHz that the Series X has. So somebody did some calculations, and I believe that this comes to a roughly 9 teraflops of power. I'm not entirely sure if that is true, I haven't ran the calculations myself, but apparently there's a 15% performance difference between these two, so between the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, of course, in the favor of the Series X, at least in terms of raw GPU power. So this might not translate into the same amount in terms of actual real-time gameplay, but the difference exists nonetheless, and I wanted you guys to know that as well. Of course, the GPU architecture is RDNA 2, as it was already implied. And now in terms of memory and interface, both of them have 16 gigs of DDR6, though in the case of the PS5 it's been confirmed that it runs at 256 bits. But the memory bandwidth is where things change a little bit. So apparently the memory on the PlayStation 5 runs at a constant 448 gigabytes per second. Meanwhile, the Series X has it split, so the first 10 gigabytes run at 560 and the rest of the 6 run at 3.3. So I think it kind of averages over here quite a little bit, so we shouldn't see that much of a difference. The internal storage though is where things change a little bit more in the favor of the PlayStation 5, and here's where like the biggest difference is from what I'm able to gather. Of course, the internal storage, which is also an SSD on the PS5, is going to be slightly lower than the one on the Xbox Series X, so 825 gigabytes instead of 1 terabyte. And honestly, I was expecting a terabyte on the PlayStation 5 as well. Kind of bummed out by this news, but it is faster, so it's almost double the speed compared to the Xbox, which should mean probably, you know, faster loading times, faster like streaming in game and all of that, but it remains to be seen in real conditions. But it's 5.5 gigabytes per second raw and typical 8 to 9 gigabytes per second compressed, compared to 2.4 raw and 4.8 compressed for the Series X. So yeah, that's quite a big difference, the biggest difference at least in terms of raw numbers over here in the favor of PlayStation 5, though again it remains to be seen under normal conditions how this translates. Now in terms of expandable storage is where I think the PlayStation 5 wins another point, because it has an NVMe SSD slot that you can expand and, well, basically install another SSD onto your console, but the Series X only has a regular HDD of 1 terabyte expansion card that you can add to it. So yeah, this means that if you can get your hands on an SSD rather cheap, it's going to be much better than an HDD, much faster loading times, much faster access times, pretty much much faster everything. Again, just the price that we're talking about. And there's still an option to install an HDD, but it comes with an USB support, so probably something similar to how it was on the PS4, the PS4 Pro, where you can just go in and like get an external HDD and connect it via the USB port. But it doesn't really specify if it's 3.0 or 3.2. I really hope it's gonna be the same 3.2 that we have on the Series X, so yeah, it remains to be seen if that's gonna be the case. And finally, the optical drive is going to be pretty much the same all around, but this also does mean that if the PlayStation 5 is slightly weaker than the Series X, it's probably also going to be cheaper. Again, nothing confirmed in terms of price point, but it does sound like that $399 mark is attainable, or at the very least the $449, though again, take this with a grain of salt because it might just very well not happen as well. So yeah, again, something that I'm quite curious about. They didn't talk too much about other stuff, other technical details. Again, all of these were talked about in the context of the presentation. All of these were, you know, given as examples, so I'm not entirely 100% sure if these are legit confirmed or just something that Mark Cerny wanted to mention in the presentation. Nonetheless, it's a huge leap from the current generation, so rest assured that most of the games will probably run at much better performance and frame rates and even resolutions than anything we had for, well, the current generation. This brings me, of course, to the next bit, which is of course all about the goodies that we will find obviously inside the new generation of PlayStation 5s. And of course, I have my list over here with some of the key talking points. Like there were mentions of ray tracing, though there wasn't much detail over this. Like they just said that this is going to be left at the decision of the developers if they want to implement ray tracing or not in their game, but the options of course exist over there. We also have to touch on the subject of backwards compatibility, because this is a very major point for me and should be for you as well. So backwards compatibility, at least from the presentation, seems to only go down up until the PS4, and even in that case only for the first 100 games. But after rewatching the presentation and just, you know, looking at the sentence and the context, it seems that this was made in the context of Sony being a little bit careful and, you know, being careful about the words they have chosen. So in this case, Sony only tested the first 100 games on the PS4 to see if they are fully backwards compatible, and they were fully backwards compatible, apparently with no issues or very little issues to begin with, which makes me really hopeful that this will extend to more than just 100 games. So hopefully this was just PR talk to not, you know, go in and say something that is factually incorrect, but we might get to see more compatibility with older games from older generations when PS5 launches. And I would even dare say that more than PS4 games might be supported. I'm still hoping for PS3 and PS2, even PS1 era games to be supported, because at that point, and especially for PS1 games, as the PS5 has definitely enough hardware to even like fully emulate those types of games. Anyway, on a final note, I also want to touch on the subject of sound quality that Sony seems to have been putting a lot of effort in, as well as the new generation of PSVR 2.0 or whatever it's going to be called. But it seems that a lot of effort has been put into these, and they are going to be a major focus on the new generation of PlayStation consoles, especially the sound quality. It seems that Sony is focusing on a full 3D audio. It seems that they have been working on something called the Tempest engine for 3D audio, and there were a bunch of scenes described over there that pretty much gives you more fidelity in terms of detecting where sound comes from, but also more immersion, since this is going to be a major focus on the new generation. So they were giving examples with a rainy scene and how in the current generation you can kind of detect where the rain when the rain droplets come from, but not so great. But on the new Tempest engine, you will be able to discern each and every single one of these rain droplets, where they come from, and overall it gives you a lot more presence and a much higher immersion according to the notes over here, thanks to this Tempest engine I was talking about. And of course this also goes with an example example with Dead Space. I believe this was Dead Space 1 that they gave an example of, but also at localizing enemies. So I can only think of horror games, for example, how more immersive they will be thanks to the new way of rendering 3D audio, but it doesn't just stop to that. So there is a lot of very advanced sound quality checks over here that Sony has been working upon and implementing and kind of giving more control over. So hopefully we're gonna see some demos of that too, but this also extends to the PSVR, which will also have a fully 3D audio pretty much baked into it. So if you ever owned any VR headset, like for example the Rift S, which is notoriously bad at its audio, this is probably going to come as a surprise to you, but also as a relief, because audio makes or breaks a VR unit. So my Rift S, for example, is simply unusable with its implemented headphones because the sound quality on that is bad, which is why most users, including myself, will use something like a different pair of headsets and yeah, kind of connect that either to the PC or directly to the unit itself. Anyway, as far as my opinion about the presentation goes, as I've said before the live stream and even during it, this was supposed to be technical, this was supposed to be aimed more towards developers, as this was aimed at the Game Developers Conference that was cancelled because of the current events, so that's why it felt a little bit too boring for most users out there. But this was something that yeah, everybody was expecting from this type of talk, though I will mention that as a result of everything that's been happening up until now, as a result of Microsoft going in and yeah, pretty much going free with all of the details on their Xbox Series X, Sony could have pivoted a little bit and maybe even adapted and actually release some proper, you know, announcements, reveals and whatnot, and maybe even show a bit of gameplay over there and some tech demos too. They could have done that. Even though these presentations are prepared months in advance, they could have done something last minute and, you know, kind of put people at ease. Is this all going to matter in like 3 months or 6 months, or when the new generation of consoles is going to drop? Definitely not. You're going to completely forget about this, maybe even like in 1 month from this point. Once E3 drops, or even before that, once Sony has its full-on reveal, nothing that was discussed in this presentation is going to matter anymore, and all of the details will be revealed by the time the PlayStation 5 is going to be released, and we're going to get all the gameplay footage that we need. Anyway, this has been pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, if you want to see more of this, consider subscribing and also leaving a like on this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.